Richard III was King of England from 1483 until his death in 1485, at the age of 32, in the Battle of Bosworth Field. He was the last king of the House of York and the last of the Plantagenet dynasty. His defeat at Bosworth Field, the last decisive battle of the Wars of the Roses, marks the end of the Middle Ages in England. He is the subject of the fictional historical play Richard III by William Shakespeare. When his brother King Edward IV died in April 1483, Richard was named Lord Protector of the realm for Edward's son and successor, the 12-year-old Edward V. As the young king travelled to London from Ludlow, Richard met and escorted him to lodgings in the Tower of London, where Edward V's own brother Richard of Shrewsbury joined him shortly afterwards. Arrangements were made for Edward's coronation on the 22nd of June 1483, but, before the young king could be crowned, his father's marriage to his mother Elizabeth Woodville was declared invalid, making their children illegitimate and ineligible for the throne. On the 25th of June, an assembly of Lords and Commoners endorsed the claims. The following day, Richard III began his reign, and he was crowned on 6 July 1483. The young princes were not seen in public after August, and accusations circulated that the boys had been murdered on Richard's orders, giving rise to the legend of the princes in the Tower. Of the two major rebellions against Richard, the first, in October 1483, was led by staunch allies of Edward IV and Richard's former ally, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, but the revolt collapsed. In August 1485, Henry Tudor and his uncle, Jasper Tudor, led a second rebellion against Richard. Henry's force engaged Richard's army and defeated it at the Battle of Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard was struck down in the conflict, making him the last English king to die in battle on home soil and the first since Harold II was killed at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. After the battle, Richard's corpse was taken to Leicester and buried without pomp. His original tomb is believed to have been destroyed during the Reformation, and his remains were lost for more than 5 centuries. In 2012, an archaeological excavation was conducted on a city council car park on the site once occupied by Greyfriars Priory Church. The University of Leicester identified the skeleton found in the excavation as that of Richard III as a result of radiocarbon dating, comparison with contemporary reports of his appearance, and comparison of his mitochondrial DNA with that of 2 matrilineal descendants of Richard III's eldest sister, Anne of York. Richard's remains were reburied in Leicester Cathedral on 26 March 2015. Richard III of England was confirmed to be haplogroup G2 and J1C2C. Childhood. Richard was born on 2 October 1452 at Fotheringhay Castle, the 12th of 13 children of Richard Plantagenet, 3rd Duke of York and Cecily Neville, at the beginning of what has traditionally been labelled the Wars of the Roses, a period of 3 or 4 decades of political instability and periodic open civil war in the second half of the 15th century, between supporters of Richard's father, Yorkists, in opposition to the regime of Henry VI and his Queen Margaret of Anjou, and those loyal to the crown. When his father and elder brother Edmund, Earl of Rutland, were killed in the Battle of Wakefield on 30 December 1460, Richard, who was 8 years old, and his older brother George were sent by his mother, the Duchess of York, to the Low Countries. They returned to England following the defeat of the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton and participated in the coronation of Richard's eldest brother as King Edward IV in June 1461. At this time Richard was named Duke of Gloucester and made Knight of the Garter and Knight of the Bath. He was involved in the rough politics of the Wars of the Roses from an early age. By the age of 17, he had an independent command Richard spent several years during his childhood at Middleham Castle in Wensleydale, Yorkshire, under the tutelage of his cousin Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, who took care of his knightly training. In autumn 1465, King Edward granted the Earl £1,000 for the expenses of his younger brother's tutelage. With some interruptions, Richard stayed at Middleham either from late 1461 until early 1465, when he was 12, or from 1465 until his coming of age in 1468 when he turned 16. While at Warwick's estate, he probably met Frances Lovell, a strong supporter later in his life, and Warwick's younger daughter, his future wife Anne Neville. It is possible that even at this early stage Warwick was considering the king's brothers as strategic matches for his daughters, Isabel and Anne. Young aristocrats were often sent to be raised in the households of their intended future partners, as had been the case for the young Duke's father, Richard of York. As the relationship between the king and Warwick became strained, Edward IV opposed the match. During Warwick's lifetime, George was the only royal brother to marry one of his daughters, the eldest, Isabel, on the 12th of July 1469, without the king's permission. George joined his father-in-law's revolt against the king, while Richard remained loyal to Edward, even though rumour coupled Richard's name with Anne Neville until August 1469. Richard and Edward were forced to flee to Burgundy in October 1470 after Warwick defected to the side of the former Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou, for a second time. Richard was forced to seek refuge in the Low Countries, which were part of the realm of the Duchy of Burgundy. In 1468, Richard's sister Margaret had married Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, and the brothers could expect a welcome there. Although only 18 years old, Richard played crucial roles in the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury that resulted in Edward's restoration to the throne in spring 1471. During his adolescence, Richard developed idiopathic scoliosis. In 2014, the osteoarchaeologist Dr. Joe Appleby, of Leicester University's School of Archaeology and Ancient History, imaged the spinal column and reconstructed a model using 3D printing, and concluded that though the spinal scoliosis looked dramatic, it probably did not cause any major physical deformity that could not be disguised by clothing. Marriage and family relationships. Following a decisive Yorkist victory over the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Richard married Anne Neville, the younger daughter of the Earl of Warwick, on the 12th of July 1472. By the end of 1470, Anne had previously been wedded to Edward of Westminster, only son of Henry VI, to seal her father's allegiance with the Lancastrian party. Edward died at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471, while Warwick had died at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471. Richard's marriage plans brought him into conflict with his brother George. John Parsons' letter of 17 February 1472 makes it clear that George was not happy about the marriage, but grudgingly accepted it on the basis that he may well have my lady his sister-in-law, but they shall part no livelihood. The reason was the inheritance Anne shared with her elder sister Isabel, whom George had married in 1469. It was not only the earldom that was at stake. Richard Neville had inherited it as a result of his marriage to Anne Beauchamp, who was still alive and was technically the owner of the substantial Beauchamp estates, her own father having left no male heirs. The Croyland Chronicle records that Richard agreed to a prenuptial contract in the following terms. The marriage of the Duke of Gloucester with Anne before named was to take place, and he was to have such and so much of the Earl's lands as should be agreed upon between them through the mediation of arbitrators, while all the rest were to remain in the possession of the Duke of Clarence. The date of Paston's letter suggests the marriage was still being negotiated in February 1472. In order to win his brother George's final consent to the marriage, Richard renounced most of Warwick's land and property, including the earldoms of Warwick and Salisbury, and surrendered to Clarence the office of Great Chamberlain of England. while he retained Neville's forfeit estates he had already been granted in the summer of 1471. Penrith, Sheriff Hutton and Middleham, where he later established his marital household. The requisite papal dispensation was obtained dated the 22nd of April 1472. Michael Hicks has suggested that the terms of the dispensation deliberately understated the degrees of consanguinity between the couple, and the marriage was therefore illegal on the ground of first-degree consanguinity following George's marriage to Anne's sister Isabel. First-degree consanguinity applied in the case of Henry VIII and his brother's widow Catherine of Aragon. In their case the papal dispensation was obtained after Catherine declared the first marriage had not been consummated. In Richard's case, there would have been first-degree consanguinity if Richard had sought to marry Isabel after she had married his brother George. But no such consanguinity applied for Anne and Richard. Richard's marriage to Anne was never declared null, and it was public to everyone including secular and canon lawyers for 13 years. In June 1473, Richard persuaded his mother-in-law to leave sanctuary and come to live under his protection at Middleham. Later in the year, under the terms of the 1473 Act of Resumption, George lost some of the property he held under royal grant, and made no secret of his displeasure. John Parsons' letter of November 1473 says that the king planned to put both his younger brothers in the place by acting as a stifler between them. Early in 1474, Parliament assembled and King Edward attempted to reconcile his brothers by stating that both men and their wives would enjoy the Warwick inheritance just as if the Countess of Warwick was naturally dead. The doubts cast by Clarence on the validity of Richard and Anne's marriage were addressed by a clause protecting their rights in the event they were divorced and then legally remarried to each other, and also protected Richard's rights while waiting for such a valid second marriage with Anne. The following year, Richard was rewarded with all the Neville lands in the north of England, at the expense of Anne's cousin, George Neville. From this point, George seems to have fallen steadily out of King Edward's favour, his discontent coming to a head in 1477 when, following Isabel's death, he was denied the opportunity to marry Mary of Burgundy, the stepdaughter of his sister Margaret, even though Margaret approved the proposed match. There is no evidence of Richard's involvement in George's subsequent conviction and execution on a charge of treason.